This week on the Eldritch Lorecast.
Critical Role obviously helped with the popularity of 5th edition. How much?
It's just truly baffling how Wizards of the Coast has so many unforced errors.
That happened. Also...
And that's why a liberal arts education is important, kids.
By the way, a bunch of MCDM people are in chat right now.
How do you get a Mountain Dew red stain out of a battle mat?
Yeah.
Dungeon Master's Guide is a weird book.
Yeah, that's news.
All the people on YouTube and Twitter poo-pooed me.
Daggerheart, was sword thigh already taken?
All that and more right now.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of the Eldritch Lorecast, the #1 tabletop RPG podcast in all the realms. That's right, this podcast is so prolific, I don't even have an analogy today to compare it to something else that would be equally #1 to this podcast. My name is Ben Byrne, and I'm here joined as always by Dael Kingsmill, Shawn Merwin, and this week joining us is Mike Christensen from the Super Geek Mike channel. Mike,
Hello.
Welcome to the Eldritch Lorecast.
Thank you so much.
I have to ask you a question because that's tradition, as we do every episode. If you were going to add a secret surprise chapter to the 5th edition Dungeon Master's Guide, which 5th edition you decide, what would it be? What would you want to see as a whole chapter?
I honestly wouldn't mind having just like something like the Radiant Citadel in there, just like a hub where it's like, hey, you can go do anything, go to any plane, any adventure. You know, at first I was thinking Candlekeep, but I think Radiant Citadel does the same thing, but way more successfully because you can go to any plane. So I think just drop the chapters they released on D&D Beyond, where it's just like, here's the introduction to the Radiant Citadel, just drop it in the Dungeon Master's Guide and be like, here you go. Here's a whole setting. You can just start right here and do literally anything you want. You can do Spelljammer, you can do Dragonlance, and Dark Sun, which I've now merged in my mouth.
I want to do Darkensun.
Dark
I want to play that.
Dale Kingsmill, what would you like in a surprise DMG chapter?
I gave this a little bit of thought. And you know, I at some point was talking about writing a D&D book, and I was thinking about chapters that I could pitch for that. And I was thinking about how every now and then you get little sort of advice sections that talk about types of players, you know, the actor, the rules lawyer, how do you deal with those types of players at your table? And I thought what would be really cool to see is a section that talks about what type of dungeon master are you? Are you a world builder? Are you a home brewer? Are you someone who likes to improv? Are you, and little bits of advice for how you can find your fun in the game while running it and preparing it for other people. Because I think that that's important and we don't really talk about it.
Shawn Merwin, if you had a super secret chapter, a super secret one of the DMG.
Well,
Not
super
just
secret, I don't know.
Yeah, super
just secret, I could answer. Super secret, that's way beyond me. No, I like Dael, I was thinking about this, and everything I came up with, I was like, no, that's not sexy enough to be like a surprise chapter, because that's just going to be there. Like my great chapter would be something like, how does the math of D&D work to help you create a great story, right? That's what would be great for me, because then I could understand how this D20 works and how all of the pluses and minuses are supposed to work to help me tell a great story, right? That would be what I would want. And for anybody else, that's like, yeah, that's in chapter 4. But it's not something that they've ever put in a book that I'm aware of that I think we as players and DMs would love to see, or at least some of us.
No, we're going to figure out a really good name for it. Something with sizzle.
Right.
Work the phrase math rocks in there somewhere.
Oh yeah, no, that's not bad. I like that. Something. The fun of math rocks. Math rocks. No, really, it's fun. Something like that.
Right.
How math rocks make your storytelling simpler.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah.
All right, I like that. We're on to something here. The elephant in the room. Let's back up here. Before we talk about Wizards of the Coast, do we need to talk about the fact that they allegedly, at this time, with the information I have, sent the Pinkertons over to a YouTuber's house to recollect some
I saw
misplaced
some articles that
property.
seem to say that Hasbro has confirmed it.
Yeah, I think that is also the case. I'm reading Linda Kodager's article, The Great Slayer of the RPG Industry. I think from what I read this morning, I'm just trying to find it again to confirm, they said that they had been in contact with Wizards who sort of confirmed the video and its allegations, and the alleged Pinkertons agents were part of their investigation, in quotation marks. So what is the, like, I kind of know the reputation, but what is the mood associated with the Pinkertons, right?
Do you want a history lesson right now?
Yes, but I'm vaguely aware, but please go ahead.
In 1892 specifically, there was a strike near Pittsburgh where steel workers were striking, and the Pinkertons came in, and basically they had a battle, a full-out war battle. So the Pinkertons are always associated with the robber barons, with the industrialists who were keeping down the workers as they tried to unionize in the United States. I live about 2 hours from where all that took place, so it's sort of steeped in U.S. history. My wife is a teacher of U.S. history, so I told her that the Pinkertons popped up again, and she did what we all did, was they're still around, and oh yeah, they're still around. Very negative in the U.S. amongst the working class, if you will.
Right.
Or anyone with a conscience.
They were functionally hired mercenaries in the 1800s. Yeah. My real only frame of reference for them is in the vastly underrated film 3:10 to Yuma, where, you have Peter Fonda's character, who was a Pinkerton who, is helping protect a coach, but also has a backstory where he has murdered many indigenous people on behalf of the railroad. So that is the reputation that they had at the time, and it hasn't gotten vastly better. Seems a little wild. WotC had their contact info.
Right? Just on speed dial? What is this?
Well, did they just go down like private security firms and they got to the P section? Like,
right.
Like what is the modern Pinkertons?
They're the Pinkertons.
They're just the Pinkertons. They're still
problem solvers. It's very.
Right.
It is.
That's what WotC looked up in the phone book. Problem solvers.
Oh no, I have a
That's
problem.
how they got to P. Yeah.
They're on Yelp under troubleshooters.
You got an issue, we can make it go away.
So the only
Take that
alleged
for
part
what you
is
will.
that they are Pinkerton agents? Is that what
I
we're...
suppose.
I guess.
Okay.
By the looks of things.
Well, the gentleman whose house they went to said they were Pinkertons. So
Sure
assuming
did.
that he's telling the truth.
I mean, did they identify themselves? Like, are they like, hi, we're from the Pinkertons.
Right.
Like, here's our card.
I mean, if you're a Pinkerton, that's what I would expect from you.
Sure.
Right.
Do Pinkertons have to identify themselves?
Like cops and TV shows?
They're not in the U.S. Constitution, or anything like that. So no, they don't. There's not Miranda rights for the Pinkertons or anything.
It's just truly baffling how Wizards of the Coast has so many unforced errors.
I have to imagine that this is one person at a specific branch greenlit this. It has to be. I can't imagine that somewhere high up in the ranks of Wizards of the Coast, someone was like, this is what we're going to go for. Anyone crosses us, we send a Pinks on them.
I like how, we're imagining the Pinkertons in a real, us Australians, in a real 1920s kind of context.
So are we.
Okay,
we haven't really heard much from the Pinkertons in the last century.
Yeah, that's what they're famous for. That's the problem. I knew that the Pinkertons were still around because in another aspect of my life, I know someone who was visited by them. So
Right.
I knew that they were still around and that they were private security. When the police aren't going to do something, but you need to get something done, you hire the Pinkertons who will investigate. So I'm trying to defend the indefensible here.
I like this hypothetical you out there.
Right.
The person out there who considers this.
So if this had been some private detective who went to this gentleman's house, right? We wouldn't be saying anything.
That's what I'm wondering, yeah.
But
I don't know if I agree with that.
And that's what the Pinkertons are. Well, it wouldn't have the historical
Right.
context to it, which is what a lot of people are going to grab onto with the union busting and the whole robber baron industrial espionage angle to it. It's just horrible connotations of what that means. Now, I'm sure that there are hundreds of companies that use the Pinkertons for these things. I am positive on that. But it just so happens that the person, this is the this is the one that we are going to learn about. So it's Wizards just bad decision making and bad luck all coming together at once to explode yet again.
It's you think about it, right? And it's MTG and Dungeons and Dragons are actually genuinely usually very separate as parts of Wizards of the Coast. They operate very, independently of one another. And then you get a perfect storm like this where the MTG people are like, it's fine for us to hire the Pinkertons. Meanwhile, maybe they didn't notice the horrible stuff that's just happened with D&D on the other side of the building, where, they've got all this stuff going on with the OGL and their relationship with influencers and stuff right now. And they're like, yeah, we at MTG will go and knock down a YouTuber's door. They didn't knock down his door, but it's not literally, at least, figuratively. Yeah. It's also just so funny to me as a YouTuber because like the takedown notice is all powerful. I'm sure you know this as well. Like it's this thing of like, if you get a takedown notice, you're powerless against it. So the fact that they didn't just send a takedown notice for those videos.
If they'd called, listen, Wizards of the Coast, not my favorite company in the world. If they'd called me and said, hey, we had a little bit of a snafu. Could you help us clean this up? We didn't mean to release those cards. Could we please have them back? I'd be like, sure. Like, I get it. There's no reason for me to hold on to these. I'm not legally supposed to have them, apparently. Good to know. I will hand them back. We've skipped so many steps to get to the Pinkertons.
Yeah, I think to clarify from what I'm understanding from Linda's article, Wizards didn't send out these sets by accident. This set found it into this gentleman's hand through, I think, a supplier that wasn't meant to release it yet. So Wizards were probably completely confused as to how this happened in the first place, because that wasn't their intention to put it in the hands of YouTubers at this point anyway. So they were like, wait, did somebody steal this? Has this fallen off the back of a truck? What exactly has happened here?
We were having a little conversation, Shawn and I, before, and James, about whether or not this is a legitimate question of whether they believe something was stolen. For me, I feel like the minute that you've sent out a product to your suppliers, your distributors, anyone early enough for them to get it out on opening day, that's the point where you have to know that sometimes leaks happen. Sure. They've happened before. It's not that surprising that someone is going to send the wrong box when one says March of the Machines and one says March of the Machines Aftermath. No one's paying that close attention to your cardboard. So I don't know whether you can really argue. I mean, it doesn't ultimately matter because who can take them to court over it. I don't know whether you can really truly argue that there was a legitimate thought that this guy, this YouTuber at this end of the chain, stole these cards with malicious intent.
Yeah, I mean, that's not what I'm saying, is that they thought that he stole them himself. They didn't know. So they're like, well, we need to send someone to investigate to figure out exactly how these cards got out there. And that's when the Pinkertons brand recognition really paid off for them. Apparently. Because they were like, well, what security firms do we know? I've heard these dudes are good, or effective,
And that's why liberal arts education is important, kids.
Yes. Please. Anyway, it's just exciting to see something that isn't just people complaining about price rises from MTG. Some exciting news for them. I apologize to Tabletop News that you didn't start early enough to get this scoop either.
It's just like, of all the people to send the Pinkertons to, YouTubers are gonna tell people about that.
That happened. Also, Wizards of the Coast put out a video talking about their new Dungeon Master's Guide that's set for release in 2024. Now that we've gotten the other news out of the way, let's discuss the fun stuff if we can. This is why I asked Shawn for the context around the Pinkertons earlier. I don't know how I'm supposed to segue this. I don't know if this is in any way appropriate to segue in this way. So
we now know what Chapter 8's the secret chapter is going to be.
Yes.
Stats for the Pinkertons.
Well, we better not spill what that secret chapter is if we find out, or we're going to get a knock on the door.
No kidding.
All right. Chris Perkins got into a video and talked all about the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide, saying that nobody in the world would probably say that the 2014 DMG is a 10 out of 10 product. And hey, look, maybe that's where we start, is reviewing the 2014 one, because for me, it was basically a magic item catalog, and that's all it was for a long time when I started running 5e. How do we feel about the early one?
I do not use it.
I use it all the time. I use about 7 charts and maybe 2 chapters all the time. And every once in a while, maybe like once a year, I'll go to one of the other chapters, including like the magic items. I so rarely have to go there because I have D&D Beyond, or I have other books I want to reference.
Sure, yeah.
So yeah, I there's some sections I use constantly and others I never look at.
Which sections do you recommend?
I really enjoy the dungeon generating, both in the appendix, but also when it's like, hey, who invented this dungeon? When it's like the adventure construction, and I like using charts for villains just to like shake up my thought process. And the early stuff as well. It's like I actually use the world shaking chart from like chapter 1, where it's like campaign shaking events. I use that constantly for backstory purposes for my world, as well as for actual world shaking events during the campaign. And then there's other stuff throughout, apparently. So they tell me.
I received mine when I ran at Gen Con when the edition first came out. I was writing and running events for it. So I got one free and I went, yay. And it was stolen within 6 months of my getting it. And I never bought another copy.
Hello, Pinkertons.
It's just, you picked up what I was laying down. Thank you. I thought it might be too subtle, but Dael had me covered. So I never bought another copy. I would use D&D Beyond to look up the charts for encounter balance until I figured the math out, and then never needed to use it again. So I think it does have a lot of great stuff in it, but I think the stuff that is in there never sort of came together in a way where a new DM, or even a DM who was looking for help, could follow the flow of it to the parts that were good. Because as we might know, it starts with, here's how you build a world. Well, actually, the first part's the introduction, where it said, we assume that you know what D&D is all about. If you're not, go buy the starter set. And I went, You're telling someone who bought the Dungeon Master's Guide to learn how to Dungeon Master to go to the starter set to learn how to Dungeon Master.
You bought the wrong product, buckaroo.
Yeah, that's not a good look.
And that was the thing I was very impressed and happy that we heard in the video.
Yeah, for sure.
I was so glad that this is such a wild day to talk about transparency at Wizards of the Coast. But I do remember feeling that way when it's like, okay, they're talking about the chapters. Oh, something sounds interesting. And then when they said, hey, why was the first book not very good? I was like, oh, we're actually talking about this. Okay, good. Like, I'm so glad. Yes, this is all still corporate PR. Yes, this is still a promotional video. But like, if you're gonna say, hey, we made a new Dungeon Master's Guide and you should buy it, I really appreciated that they said, yeah, we agree. You wasted your money on the first version, or at least it wasn't worth as much as it could have been. And all the reasons they gave, this is, everything I hear about the Monster Manual and the Dungeon Master's Guide sounds great. We don't know what 1D&D or, the 2024 Player's Handbook is going to look like, whether we're going to run it, whether we're going to use it. But everything I hear about the others, I like the design goals that they have, which are like, hey, this is not user-friendly. Fantastic. I agree. I'm glad you agree. Let's talk about that. So that was a really wonderful section in the video, I thought, of like, yeah, we didn't have enough time, and we didn't have enough money, and we didn't have enough people, and we were starting with a flawed assumption, which is that you kind of knew what you were doing already. Because they really did not know that 5e was going to hit a perfect storm of streaming, Stranger Things,
exactly.
all this stuff.
Absolutely.
So the fact that they're like, yeah, it's not very good. Like, it's not bad. It's just not very good. So we can make a better version.
Sure.
Also, these videos have been, maybe I'm just falling for the PR, but I think that these videos have been genuinely really good. Talking about upcoming products that are in playtest. I think it is worthwhile to literally say, this is what we intend for this product to be. And that's where I think we are missing some stuff when it comes to some of the, class redesigns and things like that. I would like them to say, this is explicitly what we're trying to achieve. We've seen that a couple times here and there, like after the Druid playtest came out, we heard this is what we want to achieve with the Druid. I would like more of that. But I think you're totally right that when they just come out and they say, all right, we did bad last time, this is what we're going to try to do this time, it gives us a measure to use against the new product, which I find valuable.
1,000%. If they come out and say like, hey, our goal with the new edition is to have a better sense of power creep, or we're trying to make this more heroic fantasy, I'd be like, fantastic, let's talk about this. I don't know what they're doing with the classes, and like, really, like, is it just errata? It doesn't seem like it. That's kind of what they want us to think it is. So that's why I'm so happy about what I'm hearing about the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Monster Man. I was like, great, more of this, please. More of this communication is fantastic.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Because I agree. A lot of the problems that they identified with the older DMG, people saying, I didn't know that was in there, or I can't find that if I did know that it was in there, are exact problems I've had where somebody, maybe even on this podcast, Dael talked about magic points instead of spell slots or spell points. And I was like, wait, that's in the DMG? I didn't know that. Or finding like poisons is a nightmare because it's nowhere near where traps might be. And I'm not saying those two things are combined, but when I'm looking for mechanics, they're not together. They're kind of scattered throughout the book as well.
And you never know what to call one either. You know, if you're like, I wish there was a way that spellcasting worked more like mana points rather than Vancian, and you don't know the exact term that they've used, looking it up could be a little bit tricky. Understanding what's in what section can be a little bit tricky. The way that I usually use the DMG is that I go, here's an idea for a homebrew thing I'd like to do. I'd better check that they haven't already done it. And then I have to kind of figure out where in the book it might be, decide to keep looking or give up. Did they make one? Did they not make one? And then often when I find it, I go, that's stupid. I could do better than that anyway. So, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I think the other thing is that the DMG tries to provide a lot of new, like particularly around diseases, poisons, that sort of thing, rules that have a bit of crunch to them, but are kind of superfluous and useless because players have access to lesser restoration and remove curse or whatever the spell's called,
Hero's
and stuff
Feast.
all that sort of
Poison.
stuff that just makes it, trying
Protection
to
from poison,
introduce
yeah.
those rules becomes really difficult. Super quickly, James Intricasso, welcome James, in the chat asked if Ghostfire would ever put out
By the way,
what
a
they
bunch
think.
of MCDM people
Yeah,
are in
I
chat
noticed
right
as
now.
well. Hello MCDM, welcome. Are asking if Ghostfire would ever put out what they think the DMG should be. I think we
I'll answer that question for you. Yes, we will.
Go, please, Mike. I think,
we have
loosely
to now.
speaking, we already sort of, in some way did with the Grim Hollow campaign guide, which is very Grim Hollow focused, but there were a bunch of rules in there like transformations, like advanced backgrounds, like advanced weaponry in the player's guide that provided rules and mechanics that could be used by a game master to try to capture a very specific thing for their group, which is playing a game in Grim Hollow. I think the Aurora campaign guide kind of does something similar. These are much more specific than what a general DMG would try to do necessarily, but that's because we create specific worlds, I suppose, as opposed to trying to create a setting for everybody to engage with.
The question that we're getting to here is, what should a Dungeon Master's Guide do? And is it something that a third-party publisher like Ghostfire should be making?
Yeah.
And I think that the answer is probably no, because we have an audience that expects a certain thing from us. And to create a good Dungeon Master's Guide, you need to speak to the entire community, not just a small community. And so that's not our place to do. Before I joined Ghostfire, one of the things that I was planning to do as a freelancer was make the Mastering Guide to Dungeons or something like that. It had mastering and dungeons in it because I thought we need something like this. And as just a freelancer, I can do it. The reason I didn't was because I looked around the internet and I saw that there is a Dungeon Master's Guide everywhere. It's spread out and it's not in one place, but it's being written every day by bloggers and by YouTubers and by streamers and by people at third-party publishers. And the only thing we need to do is go pull all of those pieces that are already out there, put them together, and we have the perfect Dungeon Master's Guide. It's just, I'm not going to spend 2 years reading every blog, listening to every podcast, and reading every third-party publication to make it happen.
And the thing that there's so much of an advantage to that system over a specific DMG as well. It's not that I think that there's no point in writing a DMG necessarily, but it is a tricky task because you are trying to cater to the broadest sort of blanket audience that you can. Whereas through YouTube, through blogs, through the internet, just in general, through content creators, you can cater your own perfect sort of bespoke Dungeon Master's guide, right? You can be like, I like what that person's doing. I'm not so much into that. You can curate for yourself in a way that Wizards of the Coast will never be able to curate for everybody.
Yeah, I was thinking about that when Dael, you suggested that what if the Dungeon Master's Guide included advice on how to, find your DM style. And I think they should include something like that because I find that a point of reference for that would be really, really useful. But I also know that's going to be, 3 pages, 4 pages probably. And, speaking personally, I've made about 100 videos about your style and I'm not done. It's something you can keep expanding on. And as Ben was saying, the crunchy yet not quite sufficient rules for gritty realism, poison, diseases, madness, things that are in the Dungeon Master's Guide if you want a certain style, can really be expanded on by people like Ghostfire, who are like, if you want this style, we can give it to you. It's not just a chart and it's not just a simple rule. There's a lot more thought that goes into this, but if you're willing, there's a really cool way to do this. And likewise, if you want more of a lazy Dungeon Master's approach, Sly Flourish has that approach and, has spent a lot of time refining that style. And so being able to kind of have the niches covered in a way the Dungeon Master's Guide just is completely unable to do in the page count it has.
And only Wizards can do what the Dungeon Master's Guide needs to do, which is say, this is the game that we created as we envision it. This is how we expect it to be used. So use it in this way. And as the creators of the game, that's what they're in a position to do. And that's what they sort of owe the people who are playing their game and buying their game. And so that's why I want them to do it. They have the marketing resources and the know-how and the technology and all of that to do it.
Well, speaking about what they are doing, they gave a list of the chapters that are going to be in this new DMG. It does seem laid out a lot better from the 2014 one. So not only were they saying these are the problems, but these are the ways we plan to fix them in sort of broad strokes at least. So chapter 1 being the basics, what is a DM screen for was the example used as something that is completely absent from the current DMG. And I think that's a very good question in terms of what is it for? Why would you use it? Should you use it? Why wouldn't you use it?
It's something that we just assume everyone is going to have this literacy for when they come into the hobby.
Sure,
and of course they're not. Of course they won't. We, last week, were talking about, do we use a Dungeon Master's Guide? What do we use it for? Which sections do we use? What do you put on? Did I say guide? I meant DM screen. Right. I meant the DM screen, but it is one of those things that we're just like, yes, you will have a DM screen and roll behind it. Someone needs to explain that. It's like there's always that section at the start of the book where they explain what each of the dice is, and you kind of skip past it, but it is necessary.
Chapter 2, common things and issues that tend to come up during play. This seemed a little bit vague to me in terms of what this chapter would be. What would you want to get advice on as an early GM on issues that come up during play?
The first thing that came to my mind was, how do you get a Mountain Dew red stain out of a battle mat? That's the kind of advice that we're looking for. Your board player got a D4 stuck up his nose. You don't need to go to the ER. We've got you covered.
Proper arrangement for a dice tower as people stack their dice.
Yeah. Which order creates the best structure?
Generalities has pointed out scheduling is probably going to be in there because that is, if they don't address scheduling, then what is it even for? It is the plague of our hobby.
One thing they mentioned in the video was improvising. And I think that just giving a framework for what does that mean? And I think we're going to learn a lot about their design approach based on what goes into those first 2 chapters. What do they consider the basics to be? Are there things in there going to be like fudging rolls or, I had another example that I can't think of now, or is that going to show up in chapter 2 or is that not going to show up at all because they don't want you to do it? So I think we're going to learn a lot from those chapters. I want to see Chris Perkins unleash his advice ability again, because he used to write these blogs back during 4th edition where he would just do campaign recaps and lessons from them. And I know that I think James on this show before has talked about how those are not available anymore. I'm very lucky. I printed a bunch of them out. I have a binder full of Chris Perkins advice, but the game has changed a lot since then, and the culture around the game has changed a lot since then. So being able to see what advice he has now that things exist that can give people some idea of what the game looks like Critical Role, like Stranger Things, which he called out in the video, is people have a bit more of an idea of what to expect from the game. But that cuts both ways, right? We've all heard the stories of people who now have inflated expectations of what D&D is, or now they're intimidated to be a dungeon master. Having him unleash his ability to give advice about the game, which he hasn't done in almost a decade online, I'm really excited to see that and see what and find out what he thinks is really valuable for this version of the game.
He talked about traps, not in terms of D&D traps, but traps that you might fall into or find yourself in, dilemmas at the table. So you have a power gamer or someone who takes the spotlight and somebody else is upset by that. So like managing conflicts, sort of communication skills, the teacher part of being a DM, where you have to give everyone the right amount of attention and you have to take into account the learning styles, the play styles of each of your players. That sort of thing would be perfect in a chapter like that.
You know what? Sorry, this is not what I was going to say before, but it is something that just came to mind. On Reddit the other day, there was someone asking questions that I think are just kind of expected elements of D&D etiquette, right? You know, who brings the food, who hosts, things like that. Yeah. They were sort of talking about how they can't afford to keep supplying the food every week for their players, and everyone in the comments was like, but if you're the DM, they should be bringing the food. This is a potluck. And, you know, it's just one of those things that I think gets handed down sort of folk-wise rather than being an official part of the game. But that would be a worthwhile thing to have in there. Rakema Adopoulos mentioned safety tools. I definitely expect something on safety tools in there.
Yeah, they did say that the Tasha's chapter about safety tools is just going to get ported directly in. Presumably that's in chapter 1 or 2.
Sorry, very necessary. I just my chair was going to squeak, so I muted for a second. So then I couldn't talk, but now I'm here and I'm ready to talk. The other thing Mike mentioned.
Oh, okay. You had more to say, right?
I did. Sorry, my chair is very squeaky, Ben. No, Mike mentioned improvisation, but let's also acknowledge that breaks down into multiple things that can each be scary, right? How do you improvise damage from something that you didn't expect to have to do? You know, suddenly there's a fire and you don't know how much damage the fire does when your players run into the fire. You know, you gotta come up with that on the fly. How do you improvise damage? How do you improvise bad guys? Your players have gone into a tavern and picked a fight with a random dude. You don't have a stat block for that random dude. What are you going to put together? How are you going to make it more than just an armor class and a, you know, proficiency bonus? Because I feel like that's kind of what we get a lot of the time. I like for them to have something interesting they can do in this fight that I'm going to be running for the next 40 minutes that I didn't expect to be happening. You know, little bits and bobs like that along the way. So there's sort of mathematical improvisation as well as character improvisation. How do you improvise a new branch of a story that you didn't expect to kind of come across? How do you improvise rules, like rulings on the fly? Last week, one of my players was like, I don't want to kill this guy, but how do I knock him out quickly? You know, and the rules as stated, you have to drop them to 0 hit points and say that it's non-lethal damage. You know what I mean?
Melee only.
Exactly. And it's not really what you're looking for when they're trying to, you know, bust into a police precinct. So having to come up with something on the fly that seemed like a reasonable compromise. And how do you do that if you're brand new? Yeah.
I want to run a little exercise because I think I'm the one who's used the Dungeon Master's Guide the most of the current version. So I want to run an exercise for the three of you. There is a section in the Dungeon Master's Guide about improvised damage. How many examples do you think it lists?
I think I've seen this, and I don't think it's many. I think it's like maybe 4.
Yeah, I would say 0.
It's 4. It's like 5d10 for this kind of thing, 10d10 for this. And just list like 1 or 2 examples, like 15d10 for lava, 20d10 for meteor, or something like that. where in the book do you think it is? How far in do you think?
I don't even know the chapter names, Mike. I can't begin to answer.
Is it like in the adventuring section, kind of towards the front where it's talking about environment, but it's not where the cold weather is, and it's kind of somewhere else, and it's not where the ship... I mean, this is the problem with the current DMG. It's not where the ship rules are that give you like the stats for a sailing ship and the how much hit points a sailing ship has. Yeah, that's in there, Dael. But that's that whole like basically my knowledge of the DMG is the magic items are right in the middle, and that's the super like crisp, useful stuff.
Right.
Then there's some kind of useful adventuring stuff, like traps and puzzles. I think puzzles are in there, and environmental hazards and sailing ships and their rules kind of scattered throughout the second like quarter of the book after the first chapter about like multiverses and stuff that I don't care about because I run in third-party content stuff. And then then there's combat advice. And then the back of the book is where a lot of that extra stuff around,
that's funny. I would have put magic
diseases,
items at the back of the book. If I was holding a DMG in my hands and wanted to look for magic items, I would flip to the back of the book.
Well, I mean, that's where they've moved it in the new version, and I think that is smart because in most adventuring book, like when I pick up an adventuring book, any book, like any module whatsoever, I flip straight to the back and I look at the stat blocks first and I look at the magic items second. And that's what's useful to me as a GM. And that helps me decide, okay, yeah, I will run this adventure or I will run part of this adventure because there's some stuff in here that my players haven't seen before. So this looks like it would be cool. But if there's only like 3 new stat blocks.
That every book since Ghosts of Saltmarsh has said, if you want sailing rules, go to Ghosts of Saltmarsh, which has always bugged me because you shouldn't say, we're not going to tell you how to do that in our book about, island hopping in a Greek analog. No, go buy another book of ours. I always was bugged by that, but it's so funny to me now that I know that there's also sailing stuff in the DMG.
Let me clarify. I don't know if there's actual sailing rules.
Just boat health, I think, is in that.
Exactly. Yeah, just boats.
Yeah.
Like,
so if your boat is standing still, you'll be fine.
Hey, the Dungeon Master's Guide. Yeah. By the way, Ben, great guess. Totally wrong. It's past the Dungeon Master. It's past the magic items in the section about playing on a grid, which is for some reason past the magic items.
Yeah, okay. I can see.
I also think it's really funny that playing on a grid is in the DMG because the way that the player's handbook rules are written, it's very difficult to not play it on a grid. Let's be honest.
Yes.
Yeah.
Dungeon Master's Guide is a weird book.
Chapter 3 rules compendium that isn't going into the PHB. This is where I would expect to find all the rules for the things that we've just spoken about being scattered everywhere else through the current DMG in terms of poisons, diseases, sailing mechanics, extra grappling rules, how to make a burrito, all of that sort of stuff goes into that section of the DMG. 4 and 5, adventure building, campaign building, seem
with
fairly
examples,
practical.
Apparently.
I hope encounter building as well.
I mean, I wasn't sure if just quickly, cosmology don't care about personally just because it's absolute spaghetti to me. Magic items super useful. Surprise chapter, and then appendices with a poster map of surprise. They did talk about there will be an adventure kind of included or examples of an adventure included, like encounter. I'm not quite sure what they meant by that.
He said like a sample campaign, which could mean anything. Yeah. It could be just an outline for a campaign. It could be. Dael said the magic word, which was encounter. In the current DMG, they do not talk about in most of the half that I've read so far, because we're doing a review of the current DMG in a different show. They didn't mention encounter. And I tell my class, the most important thing in game design and adventure design is the encounter. That's where the characters and your world meet and where all the fun happens. You can do all the world building you want. They can make all the cool characters they want. But at the encounter level, that's where it happens. And there is no mention in any of that about actually how to build and make fun and encounter. And they need to do that badly.
That's where the core game loop lives.
Yes.
Well, that's why I'm wondering if they've spoiled, intentionally or otherwise, their super special secret chapter, because is that chapter the adventure? the little
I think
campaign.
if there's going to be a poster map of the super secret thing.
Exactly. That would make sense to me. So
Surely.
we've cracked it.
It depends how they format it, though, right? If chapter 4 is here's an adventure and here's how you could do the same, like what they do in the player's handbook right now, in building a character, they show you, hey, and here's the character rolling for their, here's him deciding that he's going to play a dwarf, here's him deciding he's going to play a fighter. Do they format it that way, or do they just want to give you a full, here's
that's what I was thinking about.
10-page adventure? Great. Yeah, it depends how they format it.
I always look for those sort of example of play things when I'm learning a new system.
Yeah.
Okay. That's interesting.
And Chris did say that there would be a lot more examples rather than just stating something. They'll show it more than tell it, which is a good idea for a textbook to tell you how to game master.
Well, that is scheduled for release 2024. They also seem to indicate that's going to be the first book in this rules refresh before the PHB. That's what they seem to indicate in that video. Maybe I'm inferring that.
The minute you said rules refresh, I remembered that it is technically not a new edition. So it does make more sense.
Speaking of incredible things, it was pointed out in the chat to me just before. I'm so sorry, I didn't spot their name. 1,227 players got together on the weekend to come up with, certified by the Guinness World Records, the largest D&D game to have ever occurred.
Wait,
wow.
Wait, they were all in the one game?
I have no idea. I didn't read the rest of it.
Surely they didn't need to go that far for it to beat the record.
In Provo, Utah,
DM with
an owner of a game store, I think that is at the mall. The mall would come to them regularly and say, if you want to run a big event, we have this extra space in this mall that we could use. And for 8 years, this person has been planning this event. So over 200 tables, all running the same event. That was to stop the armies of Vecna, the undead army of Vecna, from doing some sort of thing. And
so were they all running the same little adventure, or were they all running different parts of the one big adventure?
That is a question that was not answered. As someone who has helped run events of close to 1,000 people, so the Guinness Book of World Records said they needed to at least have 500 players. And Teos and I called BS right there, because we have been at events where there have been, over 100 tables of 7 players running. So we knew that we've done at least that. But you cannot run a tightly organized adventure where everyone's running a different thing, because the communication is impossible to make the results actually work. Even running something with 20 tables where everyone's doing something different, trying to collate the results, is nigh impossible. So having 200 tables...
But it makes me think of that, what's that story about? Was it Legend of the Five Rings, doing some huge event where it all kind of was feeding into some larger story as it played out over the convention? Competitive D&D, speed running. We can do this.
I mean, they did Vault of the Dracolich at the start of 5th edition, was the organized event thing, right? Where everybody, 20 different parties enter the vault from a different location. We ran a version of that here, and I was so mad because I'm running my little table, and then the event organizers are like, suddenly shadows fall across every room, and then when the light comes back up, you're in a different room, and they mixed up all the players, and the players that came from the troglodyte area had convinced the troglodytes to help them, so I had 3 new players and 10 troglodytes just dumped on my table, and then I had to remember that troglodytes have smell, bad smell effects that were triggered. Oh, man, it was a nightmare. Anyway.
That sounds horrible.
Horribly fun, you mean?
At Gen Con for the launch of 5th edition, we did Corruption of Crypt Garden, which was this event. Teos Abadia wrote it, and we were running all sorts of things. And just getting the sound system to work so people could hear announcements about different aspects that were going on was almost impossible, even with spending the resources to get that. It's chaotic. So just getting 1,127 or however many people there are in the same place to play a game of D&D, hats off.
Just the scheduling alone.
Yeah, exactly.
Who
brought the pizza for that? That's what I want to know.
Pizza.
So that's news. Speaking of news, Matt Mercer is DMing the next Dimension 20 campaign, The Ravening War, set in Calorum, the food-themed setting. Gonna premiere on May 10th. I don't watch a lot of Dimension 20. Is anybody excited for this?
I'm way behind on watching any Dimension 20, unfortunately, but I think it'll be good. I like that Matt is coming to do a prequel for Dimension 20, just like Brennan came to do a prequel for Critical Role. It's very appropriate.
Yeah, I think that fan response has been fairly divided, which if that doesn't represent fandom, I don't know what does. Basically, he's running a game. There was a previous game on Dimension 20 that was Crown of Candy, which was based on Game of Thrones, basically, but everyone was made of lollies. And this is another dip back into that campaign setting and doing, I believe this is sort of a prequel. I think this is happening earlier in the storyline.
Yeah.
So think of it as House of the Dragon.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that's going to be really cool. I think that they are nerds who like D&D and they enjoy inviting each other to run stuff in their worlds. And, I think that anyone who treats it as anything more serious than that.
What is the feedback?
It's the deep lore of Calorum.
I don't want to get into it. I don't want to make enemies on this day, but, people can be very defensive of things that they love. People like picking favorites. And so when the favorites don't hate each other the way that some of the fans might.
Right.
Things don't necessarily click together as easily as they really should. But I'm excited for it. I think it's going to be good.
It looks cool. It looks like the general, again, and this is a very outsider's impression, so please don't hate me if it's one of your favorites, but the sort of fun chaoticness of Dimension 20 with Matt Mercer's kind of intensity that he brings to Critical Role makes it look like a really good time. The thing that interested me was this looks, and I'm curious if this is just how Dimension 20 does it all the time, pre-shot AF. Like, it just seems super...
Know?
No, I didn't know that they were pre-shot. I assumed they were streamed just like Critical Role used to be.
Yeah, they pre-shoot and they edit the vast majority of their stuff.
Right, okay.
Yeah, I believe they had a few live campaigns right before and during the pandemic, but during the early phase, but most of their stuff is... I think that was just like, we're doing another season of Fantasy High, but this time it's live. So it's the exception and not the rule.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which I think is going to be cool to see because, I talked about before the weird combining when Critical Role went on to the Colbert Late Show and we saw this weird legacy media approach to Critical Role style D&D. And this is going to be another thing where we see, Matt Mercer's DMing style, but through the lens of someone else's sort of presentation. I'm just a little bit of a nerd for that stuff. I think it's really cool.
I love that stuff. I'm fascinated. Often Brennan style. I haven't seen a lot of other games on Dimension 20 run by other GMs, so I don't know if this holds true for them. That might answer my question already, but often on Dimension 20, it'll be one game of all role-playing, exploration, whatever, and then the next game will be all combat. And the next game will be all role-playing exploration, and the next will be all combat, because they have these pre-built maps. And Matt Mercer, no stranger to pre-building his maps, so I don't think that'll be a difficult transition. But will he keep that same format? And that's just one example of a dozen when someone moves from one very different format of 4 hours, no edits, to, hour-long, broken into weekly installments. Very curious to see what the final product winds up as, just like it was to see Brennan come into Calamity and deliver one of the most sensational gaming experiences. So,
right, exactly.
Be just interesting to see what style that brings out. Also not the first time Matt's done a version of that, though, because he used to run games for Nerdist and for the official D&D channel from around Storm King's Thunder and Tomb of Annihilation.
Well, speaking of Matt Mercer, Pyrotechnic 777 beat me to the punch here. Yes, indeed, we have Critical Role announcing not one, but two new tabletop role-playing games. Daggerheart, which when I told my partner last night, she was like, was sword thigh already taken? I was like, all right, it's a bit generic, but Dungeons and Dragons isn't necessarily particularly bespoke either.
I'm going to write sword thigh.
So Daggerheart sounds like it's their take. They didn't say this in their press release or their video, but it sounds like, if we're to infer, that it is their 5e competitor, long-form campaign, fantasy RPG.
I want to be smug for a second, by the way. Every time I've brought it up, for the last, year at least, every now and then I've been like, I'm telling y'all, I feel like Critical Role must be working on their own game system behind the scenes, because, it just makes sense as the next step as a company. I don't think they're going to want to play D&D 5e or whatever version of official D&D. I don't think they're going to want to carry that over to their fourth main campaign. I think they're looking at a lot of changes for their next campaign, their next sort of prime streamed product that they put out there, because they do their sort of one-shots here and there. But, you've got your mainline show that they do. I think the next campaign is going to be a bit different. And I put out there that they were going to make their own system. And all the people in the chat, all the people on YouTube and Twitter poo-pooed me. Well, look at us now.
Yeah. Dael and Luboffin are very happily sitting back going, we've been saying it.
Luna in one of my live streams was saying that I was saying it on video. Luna was saying it in chat, and everyone was like, "No, they're too reliant on D&D. They would never do that." Ha ha.
Yeah, I mean, I kept turning around to Dante over the last week. Before they put out the video, they were talking about announcements, which I discovered through Luna's Twitter. And I just kept turning around to Dante going, "Oh, there's rumblings. Luna thinks that they're about to release their own role-playing game. This could be interesting." So there's Daggerheart, and also just quickly Illuminated Worlds, which is a D6 dice pool system, flexible for different settings and designed for short-term campaigns. So seems much more like I don't know if this is a D6 dice pool system, but maybe something like Fiasco or something kind of like Fate, where it's much more flexible, but not necessarily designed for long-term kind of months-on-months style campaigns. How do we think this is going to reshape the RPG industry with the most popular role-playing stream now streaming their own campaigns?
One of the biggest questions that I've had in my circles is Critical Role obviously helped with the popularity of 5th edition. No doubt about it. How much? And the answer... One of the ways you look at the answer is, how did the Critical Role RPG books sell, as opposed to how did their live stream viewing do? How did their Amazon show do? And the answer is, if it's known, they're hiding it well, because it's not like they're in the second printing of any of their books. It's not like... There was a redo of one of the books,
right,
but it wasn't a second printing. Right. So the answer isn't, we know that the fans of Critical Role rush out and buy the RPG books. And so that leads to the question, how will their own RPG do? Could be great, could be terrible, could be somewhere in between. We just don't know. The issue for me is the RPG business, as great as it is not on a level with anything that Critical Role could be doing. Right? They could be making the Critical Role movie. And by putting resources into the role-playing game, on one level, kudos, because I know they love role-playing games, and that's what they want to focus on. My second question is, will it put a bump in role-playing games in general? Or will it just be fans leave 5e, a quarter of the 5e players go play this new game. A quarter of the new players go play Black Flag, whatever the other name is and shall be. And we gain nothing in terms of the overall RPG industry. So what I hope and pray is that it does really well, and it brings new players in. Both these games bring new players in to partake of not just this game, but of all the games that we are all loving and playing and producing.
I think a lot is going to depend on when it comes out, because I think if they can get their book out before a big chunk of their audience buys the next set of Wizards of the Coast books, that's how they can get that audience converted. But we also know, listen, there's a lot of people who watch Critical Role and just sit there angry because they're playing D&D wrong. Those fans probably aren't going to go over. But there are also people who will. And the big question is, we're starting to hear, as like we're taking the temperature of the industry, that there are plenty of people who are playing 5e who don't know what Critical Role is. It is a niche of a niche hobby. So how is that enough to sustain them? It doesn't have to be, because obviously they have their Amazon show. I think two interesting things I've taken from the announcement is, one, the fact that we know Illuminated Worlds is a D6 dice pool system means that they're establishing this is different from what you're expecting, which seems to me to say the Daggerheart is going to be what you're expecting. It's going to be D20 based. It's going to be ascending armor class, all the things that we can kind of come to expect from modern D&D. I also wonder, and this is a question obviously we also can't answer, is what is their audience looking for from their products? They have Illuminated Worlds is for short-term campaigns and different settings, which is not what Critical Role does. I mean, if you'd asked me, hey, which major actual play put out Illuminated Worlds based on this description, I would guess Dimension 20. Because that seems much more that audience's vibe. Doesn't mean that Critical Role's fans won't enjoy it and won't find use for it. I think it's just going to be interesting to see, do they pick up on that, or are they just much more like, no, I want the Critical Role experience, and Daggerheart is giving that to me. They're literally putting it in the title. Critical Role shoves a dagger in my heart every few weeks, and that's what they're doing with their game as well. They're going to give me the tools I need. And kind of goes back to what we talked about earlier. If they can structure their game in a way to give us, as game masters, the tools to run the games that they run, in order of putting emphasis on the players' backstories, both from a player perspective and a game master's perspective, that I think will mean it can rise above just being another Heartbreaker. No pun intended with Daggerheart. How will they execute that? We'll see. They have a lot of talented people on the staff, and presumably they've been working on this for a while. They've seen the writing on the wall just as long as everyone else has. It's going to be very interesting to see, but those are my initial readings.
Yeah. I think that there's a really interesting... The arc of success has been so symbiotic for Critical Role and D&D. I think that anyone who thinks that D&D would have had this level of success without Critical Role is kidding themselves. But I also don't think that we can sort of shrug off the importance of it being D&D that Critical Role played.
Yeah.
I think the fact that we were talking earlier about the way that the whole of the internet becomes the DMG, right? And I think that in the wake of stuff like Tabletop on Geek and Sundry back in the day that popularized this thing of let's just show you us playing this game. And that's how a lot of people started to learn. You get How to Play. You get all these channels that are dedicated to showing you how to play a board game. That becomes the way you learn how to play a board game. So, and that's true of, any product, any industry. How do I use this thing? I can't figure it out. You don't go to the manual, you go to YouTube. Mm-hmm. So people who hear about D&D through any number of other paths, most notably probably we're talking about Stranger Things, they go, oh, what is that? They look it up on YouTube. The thing they find is Critical Role, know, and I think that it is really significant that they have made a live format version of the game entertaining, because there is so much sort of butzing about in terms of, maths and adding things up and, if that's the case, then I'm not going to attack that guy. I'm going to wreck on it. There's a lot of that stuff, and it's kept in Critical Role and people still found the entertainment value. That is an important sort of measure of how successful they are in that regard. But once we start separating them from D&D, I think we'll find that a lot of people coming to D&D did come from Critical Role. I don't think that D&D will be dependent on that. I think Critical Role will have a lot of success with its new systems, but I think that a lot of people are going to have to already be fans of tabletop RPGs before they move on to those things. And they might have found it through Critical Role. I think D&D is going to continue having people find D&D through past episodes of Critical Role.
For sure.
Whereas, you have to transform those fans of the show into people who will buy a product and try a new system and fall in love with that system. I think the timing of it is better than it could ever be for them, because we are in such a fractious state in the industry. Everyone is sort of going, sure, we'll make our own thing. So I think that it's as good timing as they're going to get for it. But I think it's going to dethrone D&D? Not a shot.
I think the other thing people are struggling with is the shorthand, right? I mean, literally, on Harmon Quest, they played Pathfinder. The Pathfinder books were visible on screen, and everyone called it a D&D show.
Yeah.
Like,
Right.
they will never not call Critical Role
I didn't
My
realize I
earliest
was playing
D&D
Pathfinder
videos
until
were
now.
Pathfinder videos that I called D&D videos. You know,
Oh,
it's,
wow. Okay.
it makes a difference in terms of brand recognition.
Well, I wonder if that's exactly why, because I think Shawn's point from the start of this conversation is incredibly salient like, I would never have thought of like multi-layered kind of thought process that I went through is I agree with Dael. I think that D&D's rise, 5th edition's rise, and I'm not the first person to say this. In fact, I remember hearing it somewhere, was kind of this perfect time in place in sort of 2017, 2018, 2016. You've got Critical Role, which is showing how to do it. You've got Matt Colville making his videos, which is this authoritative voice that can tell you how to make it easy for you to do. And you've got a system which is incredibly simple and easy to break into that doesn't feel overly complicated to play. And those kind of combined create this massive explosion in popularity with, of course, Stranger Things and other YouTubers like Sly Flourish kind of lay it in there as well, helping to boost this popularity.
And
but
D&D Beyond and VTTs.
And D&D Beyond absolutely. But every episode, Matt introduces the show by saying, we're a bunch of nerdy, vast voice actors that play D&D, and so the brand recognition is still with D&D there, right? So then, like, I'm sure they'll change that to who play Daggerheart, a D&D-like game or something. Whether they're going to change that. But I think that association, that might be why their own books didn't sell as well as the D&D books overall, is because people don't automatically associate their books with the game that they're playing, ironically. Maybe. That's a hypothesis.
It's the timing as well from D&D's end is also really clever because they've got the movie, right? The movie has come out and generated a whole lot of new interest in the game. If they can get enough out of that, they make a second movie. They create their own sort of, I've talked about this before, they're the Coca-Cola, right? Not the Pepsi. You have to convince people to drink soda. Everyone else has to just ride on your coattails, right? But they have this way of generating new players, whereas everyone else does kind of have to convince people to swap over from there. And it's not like everyone who watches the Dungeons & Dragons movie and enjoys it is going to become a player, but it has so much more reach. The net is so much wider.
I wonder, because their strategy is also interesting. The bit that I kind of left out of this news, just because in the limited time that we're rapidly running out of, and in fact have run out of and going over, they talked about their board game launch as well. They're doing, I think, at least one, the princess-themed board game. And I think they announced one other as well, or maybe I'm thinking of Till the Last Gasp, which is their dueling game they announced a little while ago.
There's another one that they referenced that they'd previously announced, but nothing's happened on it visibly.
Right, yeah. So obviously, they obviously don't consider themselves a media company purely, as they have been considered when you look at their Amazon deal and when you look at Critical Role as a production. They consider themselves, at least in part, a game company who produces games, because they're producing board games as well as role-playing games. So they're like, business strategy is obviously twofold. It's to, rake people in with their media arm to then sell the products from their gaming arm. Whether that's the best strategy for them, who knows? But
the one issue to keep in mind is that game design is hard. Adventure writing is not game design. Adventure writing is its own thing, and it can be difficult, but it's its own thing. Game design, sitting down and understanding the math and understanding how pieces work together and how to put this machine together that you're making that will accept the right inputs and give the right outputs depending on the machine, that's hard. And it takes time and it takes effort. And I hope that they can do it, they can pull it off by getting the right game designers to make the games and to look at what they want the play experience to be, because that's super important. And a lot of even game designers don't have the foresight to say, what is this experience going to be like for our end users? They just put these fancy rules together that look good, but they don't carry it all the way through. And that's going to be very telling with a bunch of games coming out in what looks like pretty rapid succession.
Mm-hmm.
I'm hoping that they went the full mile and got the people that know how to put games together to make them.
There's the other caveat or the other factor to consider is they might have a very clear, they might have finally, have sat down at the beginning of this project and figured out what makes Critical Role what it is. Let's put that into a game. Is every member of the audience going to agree with that assessment? Probably not. If there are people out there who are like, yes, Critical Role, they're going to put out their book and it's going to be a big focus on role playing. And I'm like, Critical Role is an extremely tactile D&D game as well. Like you can't pretend that they're not playing D&D and not Monster Hearts for a reason. Like they enjoy physical combat. So people are going to have their own expectations of what the books should do. And that's what we're all now getting is everyone's now speculating until we actually see the product, which we will at Gen Con, it seems like. What is it going to look like? Because right now it could be anything. The same problem that happened with Black Flag, and they had to get out in front of it really quickly and say, okay, it's not all the things you think it is. It's this. We're just doing a 5e refresh. We're not remaking the wheel completely. And so right now, Critical Role is in that sweet spot where it's anything to anyone until we actually see it and see what their version of Critical Role is, which seems like it should be obvious. But as we've seen with every fandom in the world, just because you have a very clear idea of what your vision is for the project doesn't mean all the fans agree.
That's the other interesting thing is that they haven't indicated whatsoever. And so I kind of assume at this stage it's not a SRD Creative Commons ORC licensed game in any capacity. It's not using a system that is currently shared among this kind of fracturing of 5th edition. It is an MCDM style bespoke system by the sounds of it. They haven't confirmed that, but they definitely didn't try to tie it to this is like D&D. They didn't say the words D or the words dungeons or dragons more specifically.
Ampersand.
They did not say ampersand.
Oh, the last thing I was going to say is their reach is also pretty decent. Critical Role's books are the only ones I can find consistently at Barnes & Noble alongside normal.
Right.
Like far more than I'm likely to find a Pathfinder book, I will find the World of Critical Role in the section. Pathfinder stuff is usually with the video game books. Like that's the reach of Critical Role. So I think I whether it's good or not, and I hope it's good, I think it'll still do fine because they have a pretty remarkable reach.
I was just going to say that I think it is worth noting the optics of choosing to, in this announcement, go ahead and mention this game, even though they don't have a specific release date. They haven't told us anything about it other than it being a fantasy game that is intended for long-term play. Mm-hmm. To me, that reads as planting a flag and saying, hey, we're an independent company. We're diversifying. We're not going to tie ourselves to another company's business, which I think is a smart move, but it's also a really, really difficult step. Even on the level of like YouTube, if you diversify your content, it starts getting tricky to appease your audience. But it's also something that you need to do at some point because you reach a stage where you can't keep growing if you just stick to that one thing. So I think it's a very fraught but important step for them as a company.
I imagine Tal'Dorei Reborn's reception was very validating, though. But again, the challenges of making a source book versus, as Shawn said, making an actual game system are night and day. Speaking of things that are fraught, this podcast has gone over time a lot, which is making our continued time here rather fraught.
There was a lot of news.
There was. I put some listener emails on the run sheet and we could not get to them. But if you want your listener email read out, email podcast@ghostfiregaming.com and we will discuss those topics here on the episode. Provided there isn't
the
a Guinness
Pinkertons
Book of
don't
World
get called
Record.
in again.
The Pinkertons, yeah, exactly.
We got
there. Mike, where can folks find you if they want to find more of your content?
They can find me every Monday and Thursday on YouTube at the channel Super Geek Mike. I, every other week, break down an episode of the original campaign of Critical Role, now knowing what we know, taking a look at the lessons we can learn, seeing what Matt was doing behind the scenes and what the players were doing and what we can learn from them. And in between then, I also make videos, and some of them are great. All of them are great. Some of them are well received.
That's relatable.
Yes, do go check it out. I think your videos are great.
Thanks so
if you
much.
want to keep up with the podcast, you can subscribe. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can subscribe. If you're listening to it on iTunes or Spotify or all those places, reviews are really helpful for getting us out to more people. We really appreciate you being here, and we will be back next week. I've been Ben Byrne, here with Shawn Merwin, Dael Kingsmill, Mike Christensen, and we will see you again next week.
Bum, 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 bum.
Oh, he knows.
I told you I watched the show.
He's a real viewer.
I'm a real nerd.